I knew something was wrong before I even turned off the engine. My headlights swept across the front yard, and instead of catching that familiar strip of pale concrete I'd parked on for over 2 decades, all I saw was dirt. Wet dirt, torn open like somebody had dug up a grave in the middle of my property. At first, I honestly thought I was at the wrong house. That kind of disoriented feeling after a 12-hour shift where your brain stops processing reality correctly. But then I saw my mailbox, the old oak tree my daughter carved her initials into back in middle school, and sitting dead center in the mud was a bright yellow laminated notice flapping in the evening wind like it was proud of itself. That's when I realized somebody had stolen my driveway. Now, when I say stolen, I mean literally removed. Not cracked, not damaged, gone. Jackhammered into pieces and hauled off while I was at work like some kind of suburban repo job. I just sat there for a second gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield while my hazard lights blinked against the curb. You ever have one of those moments where your anger doesn't show up right away because your brain is too busy trying to understand how something this stupid could actually happen? That was me. Exhausted, sweaty, still wearing steel-toe boots, looking at a muddy trench where 26 years of memories used to sit. That driveway wasn't fancy. It wasn't some magazine cover thing with imported brick and decorative lanterns every 6 feet. It was plain concrete. Thick concrete. The kind poured by hand back when people still built things to survive instead of impress neighbors. My father helped me lay it in the summer of 1998, right after my son was born. We mixed half the batches ourselves because we were broke and stubborn and too proud to hire extra help. I taught both my kids how to ride bikes on that driveway. My wife Linda used to drag lawn chairs out there every 4th of July so we could watch fireworks over the trees without fighting traffic downtown. Saturday mornings meant soap buckets, country radio, and washing old trucks while neighbors wandered over holding coffee mugs. Back then, this neighborhood felt like a community. Nobody cared what color your shutters were. Nobody measured your grass with a ruler. Then the HOA showed up. Well, technically they'd always existed, but for years they were harmless, mostly retirees arguing about mailbox paint and Christmas decorations. That changed when Veronica Hale became HOA president. Veronica was one of those people who treated neighborhood rules like military law. Perfect blonde haircut that never moved in the wind, white capri pants year-round, clipboard always tucked under one arm like she was inspecting prison cells instead of suburban homes. She moved into the subdivision about 5 years earlier after marrying some commercial real estate attorney downtown. And within 6 months, she'd somehow convinced half the neighborhood that our property values were being threatened by outdated aesthetics. That phrase became her religion. Outdated aesthetics. Translation? Anything with personality. One by one, the old homes started changing. Natural wood fences replaced with identical vinyl panels. Flower gardens ripped out for decorative gravel. Everybody pressured into installing the same brick paver driveways using the same approved contractor Veronica conveniently recommended every single time. And me? I became the problem. See, my house sat near the front entrance of the subdivision, meaning every realtor bringing in potential buyers passed my driveway first. Veronica hated that thing with a personal passion. You could see it in her face every HOA meeting whenever my property came up. "Ethan," she'd say with that fake patient smile, "we're simply trying to modernize the community." And I'd lean back in those cheap folding chairs and tell her, concrete was modern when the pyramids were built, Veronica. People usually laughed at that. Veronica never did. At first, the notices were petty. Pressure wash your driveway. Edge your lawn more consistently. Remove visible extension cords. Stuff designed to wear you down slowly. Linda used to beg me not to fight with them. "Honey," she told me one night while stacking dinner plates into the dishwasher, "sometimes peace is worth more than being right." But Linda had been gone almost 3 years by then. Cancer took her quicker than anybody expected, and after she passed, I guess I stopped caring about keeping things comfortable for difficult people. The house was all I had left that still felt like us. Every corner carried memories. Every scratch in that driveway meant something. So when Veronica sent me the final notice demanding I replace my concrete with approved brick pavers at my own expense, I ignored it. Not because I thought they'd back down. Because deep down I wanted to see how far these people were actually willing to go. Turns out, pretty damn far. The next morning after discovering the driveway was gone, I marched straight into the HOA office near the community pool, still covered in dried mud from inspecting the damage myself. Veronica was sitting behind the desk sipping iced coffee like she hadn't just authorized destruction of private property. She looked up at me over those oversized sunglasses and said, calm as could be, "Good morning, Ethan." I dropped the laminated notice onto her desk. "What the hell is this?" She didn't even flinch. "Community compliance enforcement. You tore out my driveway. It was deemed non-compliant under revised neighborhood standards." I remember laughing then, not because anything was funny, but because I genuinely couldn't believe another human being could say something that insane out loud with a straight face. You don't get to bulldoze somebody's property because you don't like how it looks. Veronica slowly folded her hands together and said, "Actually, according to the agreement you signed in 1997, we do." That stopped me cold, because suddenly this wasn't about landscaping anymore. This was about power. And the worst part? Veronica had no idea she'd just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. I stood there staring at Veronica for a long second, trying to decide whether I was more angry or impressed by the sheer level of confidence it takes to destroy a man's property and then quote paperwork at him like you're explaining a parking ticket. The office smelled like cheap vanilla candles and chlorine from the community pool outside, and for some reason that made the whole thing feel even more insulting. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that you hired a demolition crew to tear up my driveway while I was at work? And you think a signature from 30 years ago makes that legal?" Veronica took another sip of iced coffee before answering. "You've been in violation for over 8 months, Ethan. We sent notices, warnings, hearing invitations. You sent threats. We enforced community standards." I leaned closer across her desk. "No, you picked a fight because my house didn't fit your little catalog fantasy." That finally cracked her composure a little. Not much, just enough for her jaw to tighten. "You know what your problem is?" she asked quietly. "You think being here longer makes you special. This neighborhood is evolving. Either evolve with it or get left behind." Funny thing is, if she'd stopped there, maybe none of what happened next would have happened. Maybe I would have hired a lawyer, dragged things through court, become one more bitter homeowner arguing over bylaws and landscaping codes. But then she smiled and said the one thing she absolutely should not have said. "Besides," she added, glancing out the window toward my property, "that ugly slab was becoming an embarrassment to the entire entrance corridor." Embarrassment. That word hit harder than I expected. Because Linda used to sit on that driveway drinking coffee every morning after chemo treatments when she was too exhausted to leave the house. My son proposed to his wife, standing on that concrete under Christmas lights. My daughter drew hopscotch squares there with sidewalk chalk until she was almost too old to admit she still enjoyed it. Embarrassment. I looked at Veronica and realized she truly didn't understand people like me at all. To her, homes were investments. Assets. Exterior surfaces designed to impress strangers driving past at 30 miles an hour. But to people like me, homes were history. They carried fingerprints. And she just jackhammered mine into gravel. I left without another word because I knew if I stayed any longer I'd say something ugly enough to make the situation worse. Instead, I drove home, parked awkwardly on the curb beside the dirt crater, and spent the afternoon reviewing old property documents inside my garage workshop. That's where I found it. A faded easement agreement tucked inside a weathered folder my grandfather labeled utilities, do not discard. Now, my grandfather, Walter Mercer, was the kind of man who saved every receipt, every permit, every handwritten agreement he'd ever touched. The man documented light bulb purchases. Growing up, I thought it was ridiculous. That afternoon, it became the most important habit in our family history. See, back in the 70s, before this area became one giant HOA battlefield filled with decorative mailboxes and artificial lakes, most of this land was farmland. My grandfather owned several acres near what eventually became the subdivision entrance. When the electric company expanded service into the county, they negotiated an easement with him to install a transformer station near the road. The agreement gave the utility company access to maintain equipment, but it also gave my family oversight rights regarding structural modifications near underground lines crossing the property, including excavation. I sat there rereading the document 3 times while something cold slowly settled into my chest, because I suddenly remembered something else. About 10 years earlier, after a heavy storm knocked power out across half the county, a utility foreman came by to inspect underground infrastructure. I remembered him specifically pointing toward my driveway and saying, Good thing nobody messes with this concrete. Main feeder lines run directly under here. At the time it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. I grabbed a flashlight and walked back outside into the muddy remains of my driveway. The demolition crew had dug deeper than necessary in several places, exposing sections of conduit near the edge of the trench. One section looked scraped clean through the protective coating. I crouched beside it while evening cicadas buzzed through the humid air and just shook my head. Those idiots. The next morning, I called the utility company's emergency infrastructure line. Not angry. Not yelling. Calm. That's important. People stop listening when you sound emotional. But calm people? Calm people scare corporations because calm usually means documentation. The woman on the phone asked me to explain the issue. I said, I'm the easement holder for transformer access point 14B off Redstone County Road. Unauthorized excavation occurred yesterday over protected feeder lines servicing the Brook Hollow subdivision. I believe electrical infrastructure may have been compromised. Silence. Then keyboard typing. Then her voice changed completely. Sir, can you confirm excavation is still exposed? Yes, ma'am. And the contractors were not approved by utility engineering? No, ma'am. Another pause. I'm dispatching an emergency field supervisor immediately. Please do not approach the exposed area. 3 trucks arrived within 2 hours. By noon, the neighborhood looked like a movie set. Utility workers in reflective vests. County inspectors. Orange cones everywhere. Veronica came storming down the sidewalk the second she saw them. I'll never forget that moment. She marched across the lawn holding that clipboard like a weapon and snapped. What exactly is going on here? The field supervisor, a big guy named Curtis with sunburned cheeks and 30 years of tired patience in his eyes, looked at her and said, potential feeder compromise. Veronica blinked. What does that mean? It means somebody dug over active underground electrical infrastructure without clearance. Her face went pale. Well, can you just repair it? Curtis actually laughed a little at that. Lady, if these lines arc under load, this whole block could catch fire. That got everyone's attention real quick. By late afternoon, the power company made the call. Temporary shutdown until full safety verification and liability review could be completed. At exactly 4:17 p.m., the entire subdivision went dark. You could hear it happen. Air conditioners winding down one by one. Garage doors freezing halfway open. TVs cutting off through open windows. Then silence rolling across the neighborhood like somebody muted the world. I won't lie, standing there on my porch watching lights disappear house by house felt incredibly satisfying. Not because I hated my neighbors. Most of them were decent people. But because for the first time since all this started, the consequences landed where they belonged. On the people who thought rules mattered more than common sense. Day 2 was confusion. By morning, the HOA Facebook group looked like a digital war zone. People furious about spoiled groceries, dead internet, canceled remote meetings. One guy claimed his exotic fish collection was worth 20 grand and blamed Veronica personally for aquatic negligence, which honestly still makes me laugh. Generators sold out at every hardware store within 30 miles. Families started sleeping in hotels. Kids wandered around outside sweaty and miserable because summer heat in Tennessee without AC feels like breathing through a wet towel. And through all of it, Veronica disappeared. No Facebook updates. No HOA statements. Nothing. Then on the evening of day 3, just as the sun started dropping behind the trees, I heard a knock at my front door. Not pounding. Not angry. Just hesitant. When I opened it, Veronica Hale stood there holding a folder against her chest with both hands. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked scared. For a second, neither of us said anything. The porch light buzzed above us, moths bouncing against the glass, and Veronica just stood there in complete silence wearing none of the armor she usually carried around. No clipboard, no polished smile, no rehearsed HOA authority. Just a tired woman sweating through an expensive blouse while half the neighborhood cursed her name in the dark. You gonna invite me in? She asked quietly. I looked past her toward the street. Houses sat dim and still except for the occasional glow of portable generators humming like angry lawnmowers. Somewhere down the block a dog barked nonstop because somebody's electric fence had stopped working 2 days earlier. The whole neighborhood felt different now, stripped down somehow. Honest. I stepped aside. Veronica walked into the kitchen and sat carefully at the table Linda picked out 15 years ago from a clearance sale neither of us could really afford at the time. Funny the things you notice during tense moments. Her eyes wandered around the room, landing on family photos, old baseball trophies, the faded "Welcome Home Dad" banner my daughter refused to throw away after my surgery years ago. "This house feels lived in," she muttered. I leaned against the counter. "That's usually what houses are for." She almost smiled at that, but it disappeared fast. Then she opened the folder. Inside was a stack of emergency petitions from homeowners demanding immediate restoration of power. Complaints. Threats of lawsuits. One page had screenshots from the neighborhood Facebook group where people were openly calling for Veronica's resignation. "She's ruined this community. Who tears up somebody's driveway without permission?" My mother's oxygen machine barely made it through the night. That last one hit harder than the others. Veronica rubbed her forehead and whispered, "I didn't know about the utility lines." "I know. You could have warned us." I let that sit in the air for a second. Then I said, "Would you have listened?" That answer arrived in the silence between us. Truth was, Veronica didn't start out evil. Power like that rarely does. Over time, she'd just surrounded herself with people who praised control and called it leadership. Every tiny victory fed the next one until eventually she stopped seeing neighbors as people and started seeing them as obstacles between her and the perfect community she imagined in her head. I think somewhere during those 3 dark nights, reality finally punched through the fantasy. "I made a mistake," she admitted softly. "No," I replied. "You made several. That one stung." "Good." She slid another document across the table. "We'll pay for the replacement driveway." I looked down at it, then back at her. "No brick pavers." She nodded immediately. "Concrete." "My design." "Yes." "Full reimbursement for property damage." "Yes." Written apology posted publicly to every resident. That one made her hesitate. Not long. Just enough to tell me it hurt. Finally, she sighed. "Okay." But I still wasn't done. "You're also covering landscaping restoration, utility inspection costs, temporary parking damages, and legal filing fees." Veronica stared at me for a long moment before asking, almost defeated, "Is this revenge?" And honestly, that question bothered me more than I expected. Because standing there in my own kitchen with this exhausted woman across from me, I realized revenge wasn't actually what I wanted. Not really. If I wanted revenge, I could have dragged this thing out for months. Maybe longer. The utility company lawyers were already circling. The county inspectors were furious. One serious investigation into unauthorized excavation around active feeder lines could have financially buried that HOA forever. But that wasn't the point. The point was respect. People deserve to feel safe in their own homes. They deserve to know some committee can't erase pieces of their lives because they don't match a neighborhood color palette. So I looked at Veronica and said, "No, this is correction." She signed everything. Fast. Faster than any HOA violation she'd ever mailed out. The utility company restored temporary service the next afternoon after emergency shielding was installed around the exposed lines. Full repairs took another week, and during that time the neighborhood changed in ways I didn't expect. People started talking to each other again. Not through HOA emails. Not through complaint forms. Face to face. Neighbors dragged lawn chairs outside at night because air conditioning still worked only intermittently. Kids played flashlight tag in cul-de-sacs. Families shared extension cords and generator power across driveways that, ironically enough, no longer looked perfectly identical. One evening, old Mr. Barlow from 3 houses down wandered over holding 2 beers and said, "You know, this place used to feel like this all the time before the HOA turned everybody into hall monitors." I laughed and clinked bottles with him. A week later, they poured my new driveway. Concrete. Smooth, thick, solid. I stood there early that morning with a cup of coffee watching workers spread and level the surface while sunlight pushed through the trees. The smell of wet cement brought back memories so fast it almost hurt. Linda laughing while spraying me with the hose during the original pour. My son leaving tiny sneaker prints near the edge before the concrete cured. Life moving forward one ordinary moment at a time. One of the workers looked over and asked, "You want us to stamp any decorative pattern into it?" I smiled. "No, leave it exactly how it is. Simple, strong, honest." Just before sunset, Veronica pulled into the driveway entrance and stepped out of her SUV. She stood there awkwardly for a second before walking toward me. "I posted the apology," she said. I saw, and I resigned from the HOA board this morning. Now that surprised me. She shoved her hands into her pockets and looked down the street where kids rode bicycles under the orange evening sky. I think somewhere along the way, she admitted quietly, I forgot this was supposed to be a neighborhood. Then she left. I never saw her again after that. Heard she and her husband moved to Nashville less than a year later. The HOA still exists, but these days they mostly argue about pool hours and holiday decorations like normal people. As for my driveway, still there, still concrete, still mine. And every once in a while, usually late in the evening when the neighborhood gets quiet, I'll sit out there with a beer and think about how strange it is that people spend so much time trying to control each other instead of just living. But I'll tell you this much. Nobody in Brook Hollow Estates has touched another man's property without permission since. Now here's what I want to know from you guys. Was I justified shutting down the power knowing the entire neighborhood would suffer for what the HOA did, or did I take things way too far just to make a point? Because honestly, even now, I still go back and forth on that sometimes. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare yourself, subscribe and stick around. Trust me, these stories get crazier than people think.